11. Well, close enough.
His most recent essays include Resident Racist, Embodiment in Game Control and Mechanics, Pearson and Technobiography, Industry Agency and the Network Body, Cecilia Wang. His current research examines the industrial applications of game engines.
Thank you. So I have one content warning, which is childhood death, animated childhood death and violence, without sound, and it's a very brief. I stop it before we get too far into the violence. So my work is about understanding game engine technologies, and this particular case study considers the role of the game engine as part of the game development pipeline, as part of an industrial arrangement that might help us understand the production of meaning. And it positions game development as a richer and more proper textual field. This is not to critique people who study representation, but my goal is to position game development as a richer and more proper textual field and provide an overview of the relevant discursive tensions that emerge as game developers start to negotiate the publication cycle, the hardware cycle, and the cultural demands of audiences. And it proposes how a queer analysis might inform an industrial analysis. So my analysis is really designed to help game scholars and developers understand how to critically examine game engine technologies and to encourage broader intellectual and creative consideration of the role of engines in an industry commonly read as a series of playable intellectual properties. So my session opens up, hopefully, a space for independent game engine developers to discuss their relationship to more dominant engine developers, such as Unity and Unreal, and proposes how a queer analysis of the work in progress and the technologies that undergird the work in progress might strengthen more generalized discussions of the representational politics of video games, their audiences, and their production communities. Engine development, by its very nature, suggests a well-defined separation between core software components, such as rendering, collision detection, and audio systems, and the art assets and rules of play, although the line between the game and the engine may shift within any one development studio. The engine is a data-driven architecture, while a game contains hard-coded logic or special case code to render specific types of assets. The game engine can best be understood as a foundation, though the engine itself can be subdivided between runtime components, target hardware, device drivers, OS, SDK, core systems, resource manager, rendering, debugging, collision and physics, animation, and the list goes on. And a tool suite, the digital content creation suite, that suggests even more deeply bifurcated fields of production and analysis. Where do you choose to place your attention? Stepping back from such a deep level of scrutiny, and admittedly it really is a simplified starting point, my case study considers two facets of the game development pipeline, the engine and the trailer, that seem to occupy really opposing critical and industrial positions, where we have the visual seductions of the trailer that mask the unceremonious and decidedly non-visual machinations in industrial labors of code, but from a broader view may help us understand the production of meaning and untangle the multiple paradigms of game studies. The proprietary game engine is elusive, it's pure code, oftentimes devoid of a graphical user interface. So there's really little to see there but script, so it makes it a difficult object to analyze. Yet several of the major 3D authoring tools, including Unreal and Unity, and their respective parent companies, have had a significant impact on contemporary visual culture. For those of you who are familiar with Unity and aware of sort of Unity's contracts with NASA and the US Army, we can see that game engines are part of a larger industrial military complex. Game trailers may reveal or conceal the mechanics of the engine itself, celebrating the attributes of interaction and occasionally showcasing machine-based physics or illustrating the narrative impulse or the signpost of agency. While we can look at the interface as the critical zone that constitutes the user's experience, it can't be untethered from the more subtle trails of these core technologies that drive embodiment, where static and dynamic elements are defined, world chunks are delimited and fixed. Adrian Mackenzie suggests that software is a, quote, multidimensional and mutating object of analysis, end quote. And software represents merely one set of fixed relations for what is otherwise a contact-free set of abstractions, and the developer's selection of a game engine serves as the most significant transactional limit. And for those of you who have heard me ask questions during the conference, it's oftentimes like, what engine did you choose, and why did you choose that engine? And oftentimes we choose an engine based on what we're familiar with, what we have access to, what we've been taught in school or in another sort of out-of-school context or online. So we can think of that as the most significant transactional limit. While game trailers are often understood as advertising agents, they are also deployed as signs of quality, as early demonstrations of gameplay mechanics and visual artistry. Yet trailers more generally stand as conflicted texts, as self-contained and readily analyzed objects, as well as a form of shorthand of the development pipeline for unfinished games with unspecified release dates, unfixed narratives, undecided forms of interaction, and in many cases, undecided engines. As such, I believe they stand in a unique critical position, speaking to the distinct binaries of developer and audience, hardware and software, engine and interface, as uniquely mutating, queerly open objects. Indeed, a more nuanced approach to game studies should consider the relative fluidity of the work in progress as a not fully realized body and the formative conditions of core game technologies. As distinct points of analysis, consider the following two examples. Okay. So according to game publisher Deep Silver, Techland's Dead Island, have any of you played through Dead Island? You might be familiar with the announcement trailer. According to Deep Silver, Techland's Dead Island February announcement trailer, a promotional film created by UK animation studio Axis Productions, is meant to be illustrative of a scenario that might befall a typical vacationing family on the island, the game's principal setting. And this is, I'll just show you a snippet of this trailer. Oh, we do have one down here. Okay. So in this instance, what we can talk about is the game was developed, although we can see this as purely an animation, the game was developed with the 5th iteration of Techland's proprietary Chrome engine, first used in 2003. The trailer illustrates neither engine nor assets. For those of you who actually played the game really looks nothing like this. The trailer contains neither cinematics nor gameplay. It's a distinct short-form animation project produced by this independent studio, Axis Productions. So, as such, as a short-form animation project, it stands as a phantom limb of critical inquiry, detached from the body of the game and disassociated from the production pipeline. Unlike the game, it does indeed stand as a text to be read, laden with cultural value simply in terms of its representational politics of viral heteronormativity disrupted from without and within, and not in terms of more complex forms of embodiment. As such, it lies outside the primary vectors of critical game studies. When engines are revealed in public previews, such as Techland's Chrome Engine 4 demo, and I'll just give you a shot of their demo. You don't really need to listen to the soundtrack for the demo, but just so you can hear it, this is how these demos typically play out. So this is one iteration of the engine that actually drives Dead Island. You don't need to listen to that. When engines are revealed in public previews, such as Techland's Chrome Engine 4 demo, they are presented as isolated on-rail displays designed to illustrate rendering power through visual spectacle, rather than the coded depths of each software layer, a fact reinforced by their status as objects belonging to, but not of, a game. Most demos posit a relationship to a particular game title, in this case, the Chrome Engine 4 is connected at the end title to Call of Juarez, Bound in Bloods, powered by Chrome Engine 4. As a similarly conflicted object, I turn to PT. Have you played PT? Yeah, fantastic. PT is a playable teaser and promotional vehicle for an unreleased. Just pause this. For an unreleased game property developed by Kojima Productions and published by Konami that showcases the mechanics of an engine, but again has an uncertain relationship to its parent company, although in this case for different reasons. Released for the PlayStation 4 in August 2014 as a free download on the PlayStation Network, PT served primarily as an interactive teaser for the game Silent Hills, a canceled installation in the Silent Hill franchise to be directed and designed by Hideo Kojima in collaboration with Guillermo del Toro. After the cancellation, Konami removed PT from the PlayStation Store and eliminated further installs or reinstalls of the game through its network and onto its consoles. So for those of you who don't have it, the only way to get it now is to buy someone else's PlayStation 4 with the game already loaded and ask them for their username, and it's a sort of complex array that can net you lots of dollars on eBay. So after its cancellation, Konami moved it. And for those of you not familiar with the game, I'll just play you a brief snippet of what this game looks like. So the teaser, the playable teaser, plays as a series of ever-changing hallway loops, with each pass marked by environmental changes and cues that, when sequenced correctly, unlock a final cutscene revealing the nature of the game and its role in the franchise. With the cancellation of the game, PT exists as a self-contained intellectual property, a game in itself with uncertain status as a video game, a demo, a teaser, or perhaps the mechanics of the full property, since they were never fully defined, are far and apart from what we actually see played out here. PT was developed with the Fox engine, a proprietary cross-platform, cross-generational game engine built by Kojima Productions under lead architect Julien Merceron for use in many Konami games, including Metal Gear Solid 5. So I see this as sort of a pure illustration of the engine, this navigation through an environment on an infinite loop, much like Chrome Engine 4's sort of release trailer. This is a snapshot of sort of the sort of marketing campaign around the Fox engine demo in 2011. The engine makes it possible, like most engines, for Kojima to develop multi-platform games with a significant shortened development timeline. And the engine was presented in this demo form in 2011 at Konami's pre-E3 conference. Like most engines, the Fox engine contains a level editor, animation editor, cutscene editor, FX editor, UI editor, sound editor, motion editor, and other forms of editors. And it uses physically based diffuse albedo maps and incorporates reference models to test the effects of linear space lighting and to maximize its photorealistic effect, making game textures from photographic textures in physically based rendering. The engine utilizes a linear gamma-corrected workflow to produce more accurate renders, and these detailed environments and assets are capable of running in real time. The goal of the Fox engine is realistic, oftentimes to disconcerting effect in some of its snapshots about its use, where we can drop a variety of assets into a realistic environment to rather disturbing effect. In this case, it's just simply one of the snapshots that illustrates the Fox editor that makes the unfortunate incident of dropping in characters from the game in direct conflict with one another, sort of, again, the representational politics of sort of brutal colonization ripped out of the game narrative seem to be at work in this particular still that illustrates the mechanics of the engine. The goal of the Fox engine is realistic, physically accurate output realized by studying and measuring the details of the world outside the game while still situating photorealism in context defined by the material rules of the game. As with most engines, success is measured by the naturalness of the relations across engine, asset, controller, character, and player, relations that are circumscribed by the historical, technical, and material conventions of the industry. As a playable environmental loop, I believe PT is a fairly close visual approximation of the spatiotemporal gradients and power of the engine, although for those of you who have played through that teaser, its closing cutscene reattaches it to an already value-laden serialized intellectual property, that of Silent Hill, fixing its status as something other than a mechanics-driven environmental problem, a puzzle to be solved. The fragment is restored. For developers, game engines create a series of fixed relations, but also present a necessary mechanical order, a software framework that lays out core functionalities. Game engines make the process of development more economical, which is why most of us use them rather than develop our own engines. But the need for rapid development and cross-platform deployment that engines answer also presents a trade-off between order and control, freedom and possibility. The engine allows the insertion of an infinite variety of assets and perform the same way. And while this may seem to make selection more important in the conveyance of meaning, the engine provides the syntax and produces the relative openness of the game universe. So for my purposes, the engine sets an initial limit that everything else must then follow. The engine controls the soft and hard physics, determines the relative utility of exploration, emits the signals of agency, it determines the relative impact and the realness of our avatar's presence on the world we inhabit. And the general push that we see in these engines, at least the AAA engines, is toward realism in effect and affect. Engine, code, and 3D design, bound together in the game production pipeline, introduce operational limits that bind together these correspondences. The more you try to pin down the ideological critique of what an engine is doing, the more one sees that such critique is undermined by the existence of something that really is altogether different from ideology, and that is informatic code. So if we understand at this point in the game production pipeline that the engine and identity is a data type, a mathematical variable that is literally bound to bodily articulation and played potential, we can see that this type of typing really forces us to look beyond the representation, to look underneath it, to find its coordinates. And I believe my purpose here is that there's a broader lesson in shifting our attention to the deeper architectures of game design while not abandoning the image altogether, a lesson that may be aligned with one of the possible futures of queer and feminist media studies. By studying software, we are unlocking our ability to be mindful of the manner in which closed design and deployment systems push us in particular directions toward a certain technocentric certitude, and we become much more mindful of the limits that are set upon ourselves as developers and readers of game texts. In the case of code, the call to order is a protocol that cuts across multiple industrial sectors and functions and creates limits. It satisfies multiple bodies and conjoins programmers in a closed-loop information system. Programming code, like language in general, evokes complex processes, but is inherently reductive and delimits what we can do as actors and as agents. New media theorist Friedrich Kittler notes that, quote, programming languages have eroded the monopoly of ordinary language and grown into a new hierarchy of their own, end quote. And that's my general call, is to understand where is the space for possibility for queer game makers, for radical queer sensibility, and how does that shrink through the process of development. While this is true as well in the more obvious signs of game trailers that fix meaning in parallel ways and tell us, making sense of even the most open game in as a knowable marketable property, the compromises that are made in the selection and use of the game engine are much subtler. For those of you who went to John Epler's talk, John pointed to several of these parameters in his keynote, discussing the importance of a broad continuum of game documentation. The choices made in marketing material that set a series of limits are just as important as the default character rigs in the binary data sets that delimit hero gender male or hero gender female. Many indie developers, in the pursuit of efficiency, have no choice but to accept this limit, have to tie their intellectual properties to the systematized writing associated with engines, have to see their works operate less queerly and less out of bounds. There are a broad range of engines in development environments, more dominant, costly, high-powered tools such as Unity and Unreal, and alternative entry-level tools such as Twine and GameMaker. The latter have been celebrated for their accessibility. Twine is a free, open-source, browser-based tool that requires only basic HTML. But more significantly for queer game artists, they seem to facilitate qualities such as empathy, community, and communicative openness. But my point is that we need to avoid understanding even the value of engine choice in such binary terms, as freedom, expressivity, multivocality, and queerness are in every case delimited by software mechanics. And some game critics claim the interactive storytelling of most Twine games follows normative prose, so there's a certain sort of colonizing or centering effect in the type of prose that is possible even in Twine. And at the same time, Twine communities don't commonly interact or intersect with unity communities. So we have these different communities that then exist, even if we see more fluid gendered binaries, creating a set of linguistic barriers between those who have been taught to code through Unity as part of most academic interactive media programs and those who have not. GameMaker, similarly, is primarily a 2D engine that features a drag-and-drop system, a proprietary scripting language, GML, and a fairly deductive build process of rooms, objects, and pre-built script events. But the simplicity of GML writing does not align neatly with the stricter requirements of more complex programming languages, so once again, we may see the bifurcation of these game development communities. And users of RPG Maker, sort of one of my last examples, sort of learned about speaking to some people at the conference here, the frustrations with RPG Maker. Users of RPG Maker have formed communities of their own to overcome many of the engine's inherent physiognomic defaults or absences, such as the impossibility of rendering accurate skin tone, hair color, and texture to convey not simply aliens, but the diversity of racial and ethnic representation in the communities that we all experience. All development tools work by trafficking in these signs, in these predetermined languages. As a whole, these practices reveal the evolving contours of technobiography. They speak to the degree to which our bodies, our networks, and experience can be quantified. And because of their diversity, these engines may foster a greater understanding of the nature of autobiographical knowledge and the relative utility or free play of autobiographical exchange in game space. Game engine design and the chronology of use and version history limits and conceals whether otherwise mutable relations. And that's the very nature of an engine. The value of the engine lies in efficiency of labor and reuse. The experience of movement, of environment, of subject-object relations are all really bound by the engine. So there's no transformative enactment, for this is no fundamental unmasking of the environmental mesh, no fundamental reworking of the landscape, no undoing of static and dynamic assets. And this came up recently in the sort of Monster Factory sort of conversation of, does that ultimately undo, does that lead to chaos in the engine itself? And the answer is certainly no. It's not to devalue the use of those texts in terms of a free expression and artistic experimentation, but they don't ultimately destabilize the game world itself or the engine mechanics. They aren't designed to do that. That's a sort of physical impossibility. The historical conditions of engines are concealed by versioning, as swappable assets become the only knowable and comfortable signs of difference. That's the bind, for technological revealing circumscribes and cancels historicity, lures us into the myth of technological determinism. And my goal is to call into question the effects of rendering experience representable and commodified as a resource by looking to the rendering engine and the resource manager. And to be truly transformative as queer subjects, media studies must consider games as a process and a pipeline, or risk effacing or erasing the labor capital of a significant body of individuals in an industry situated primarily and studied primarily through its intellectual properties, its objects, and its representations. Thank you.